it over to Dr. Djelani.
So good afternoon, everyone. I won't take too much time today because I think we want to focus on Dr. Sandra Gibbs and Dr. Barbara Hamm and their presentation and their expertise. But I thought it might be a good idea to start with some context of what we've been doing over the last few weeks and to contextualize how the medical aftermath and the psychological aftermath of the whole institution of race and economics in the United States fits into the whole of where we are today and the different aspects of trauma that we experience as Black people, not only in the United States, but around the world, because the institutions that were created at the beginning of slavery were institutions that started in feudal European countries that impacted the whole enslavement of human beings in the United States, much more in the Caribbean and in South America, and then the period of colonization around the world. And many of these institutions and structures that were put into place in the late 1500s, early 1600s are still in place today. So we really want to hone in on the different aspects. So over the last few weeks, we've talked about different aspects of trauma. The first few weeks we talked about vicarious trauma, and this is dealing with the fact that every day we're bombarded with images and videos of Black people being harmed around the world. Police brutality. We started on June 19th, and at that point we have a whole lifelong library of videos of people being harmed. So what is this vicarious trauma, although it might not be happening to us? What impact does that have on our psychology? What impact does that have on our physical well-being? We talked about microaggressions as a form of trauma, the day-to-day impact of the very little slights that people might experience. Might be because of the color of your skin, might be because of your gender, might be because of any other aspects that are not a part of the dominant culture. And these slight impacts, someone once described it as death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's all the little things that happen over and over and over again. You're waiting in line at a grocery store and you're overlooked because a white man might be standing behind you. Or you might be an expert in something and they'll look to the white man or maybe the white woman as the expert, and you're actually the one in charge. So those are microaggressions. We talked about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, and these are all the embodied things that we learn over time that we pass on from generation to generation to generation. These are practices that might not be actually psychologically sound, but it keeps harming us. The way we talk to each other, the way we react to the world, all of these practices that are not necessarily healthy for us. And so then we began talking somewhat about the economic trauma of existence, specifically in the United States, but it is also around the world. What slave trade started as an economic practice. It started with Irish people and poor people being sent to the United States and around the Caribbean as a way of exploitation of those people. And then Africans became known as property, and they were sent around the country, around the world as property. And so this is the beginning of that relationship between race and economics. So you really can't talk about race unless you also talk about economics, because those two things, along with gender and religion and other different aspects, all of those aspects have been inextricably linked since the very beginning. And so specifically for Africans, there has been a persistent narrative of, you really don't belong here. You're really not human. You're really barbaric. We need to train you. We need to control you. And these narratives continue to impact us. So the last thing that I mentioned last week was narratives matter. So it's really important how we talk about each other, how we describe ourselves, whether you're talking about colorism, whether you're talking about unproven narratives about who Black people are, repeating those narratives. We have to really, really pay attention because these narratives will impact everything in our existence. And so in the very beginning, as naming Black people as property and profiteering on those narratives, in the very beginning, slave ships were insured. So from the very beginning, insurance played a big part of how human beings were transported around the world. So it's not true that people came to the United States for oppression of the king. They came to the United States as the head of these ships as investors, basically. So they were making investments around the world, and these investments were insured. These slave ships were insured. So you have like the big beginning of the growth of the insurance industry. Many of those insurance companies, they perhaps changed names or changed practices, but this is the very birth of the nation. These were big investments, and property was controlled by the very 1%. And these were white men, and it parallels to today's 1%. This 1% controlled everything. These 1% or small fraction of the population who owned slaves and who brought indentured servants here, they controlled the way people live and existed. They were the only ones who could vote. Not all white men could vote, so certainly the indentured servants, they couldn't vote. They were not exactly property as the African bodies were, but they had no power. All white men couldn't vote in the United States until the late 1700s. So that you have white men enfranchised, but no one else. So these people controlled everything. So these insurance companies have circled throughout the history of American hegemony. And so it's important to always keep that in the back of our minds, that this is an economic process. And so this, when you look at Wall Street today, Wall Street was a location for slave trade. And I think the mayor of New York City finally placed a marker on Wall Street that marks this history. Wall Street was a place where enslaved human beings were auctioned and sold off on a daily basis. So when you hear Wall Street, you're really talking about the profiteering from people's bodies. And so this history goes back from the beginning, and it still recapitulates today. So when you think about things like national health care, this goes back to insurance companies, it goes back to profiteering from human bodies. And so when we think about Wall Street, we're talking about the imprisonment of the largest prison population in the world, in the United States. And this is bought and traded every single day on Wall Street. So you're profiteering from people's bodies. And so I'll just speak a little bit about the specifics of Black bodies as profit in the United States, specifically starting from Wall Street and then also in medical practices. So I don't know if you've heard of the father of modern day gynecology, Dr. J. Marion Sims. He lived from January 25th, 1813 until November 13th, 1883. And he is considered the father of modern day gynecology, and he is still named in medical books as an expert on gynecology. Dr. Marion Sims, he used Black women to test out his theories. And so when he tested out his theories, he did this without anesthesia. So Black women were basically tortured in his practices. So recently, in the last 3 years, Black women have come together to protest a statue that was in New York City, to protest the removal of this doctor because of his vicious, inhumane practices on Black women. But there's a whole history to that as well. When you think about someone, there's a Mr. John Brown, who was an enslaved human being who was sold a few times, and he ended up in Jones County, Georgia. In the 1840s, his quote unquote slave owner used him to, and this is economically also tied into this, he used his body to test out his theories on heat strokes. And so he would administer low level heat to this human being, and then he would increase the heat until Mr. John Brown was unconscious. And he did these practices over and over and over again. And he did quack experiments to see how Mr. John Brown could sustain and what would revive him. And he found that cayenne pepper was used to revive Mr. Brown. And so he created some capsule made of flour and cayenne pepper that he was peddling around the United States. So really he was using Mr. Brown's body to make money from some sort of quack experiment. So Black bodies have been used, and certainly we understand and remember, because it's been included in the popular narrative, the Tuskegee experiment. And that the Tuskegee experiment was from 1932 to 1972. And I don't know who's on this Zoom call, but most people in this Zoom call were born at that time. So you're talking about our own history where Black bodies were used to, as exploitation, as experimentation, as for profit making. So we have to always continue. From 1972, that was basically a minute ago. So we have to always think about medical profession and how it is used for economic purposes. So around the turn of the last century, there was a movement to make national health care for everyone. But the Southern senators did not want this because at that time, African Americans and Black people in the United States were still considered 3/5 human. So even though the laws may have changed, the narrative was still that you don't belong here, you're only part human. No, you're not getting national health care. So when you talk about Medicare for all, you're talking about a long history of this. This is nothing new. And persistently, it has been so that Black people could not get the advantages of everyone. And so you have the early formation of the National Medical Association, and this was because Black doctors were not allowed to join the American Medical Association, so they created the National Medical Association. So you might look into that. There's a wonderful podcast and several articles in the New York Times that were popular last year called the 1619 Project, and she specifically outlines the National Medical Association and their push for national health care for everyone. Given that, you can think about the disparities of Blacks and their access to medical care. This all goes back to economics also, in that desire to make profit off of Black bodies. So if you don't have insurance, you're going to pay higher premiums or don't have access. And so when you think about the pharmaceutical industry, all the money that is made on pharmaceuticals, when in fact, we as American taxpayers, we pay into the research and development of all medicines through the National Health Institute and through all the research universities across the United States. Think about something like insulin. Insulin was developed by quite a while ago, and the inventors donated insulin to all of us free of charge with no patent. But companies have appropriated that, and now insulin is very, very expensive, and a lot of people don't have access to it. It goes back to the economics always. And so when you want people to have health care, and the insurance companies who have a long history in profiteering off of Black bodies, it goes back to profits over human beings. So I just think in the context, I wanted to say all of those things and to think about the disparities of healthcare that we experience today. I'm making this very, very quick, I hope, so that we can move on to the experts. And as we think about that, to think about the disparities that you've seen perhaps in the AIDS crisis, where African Americans in certain cities still persistently experience more infections. And so thinking about this around the world also. And you think about how, when we think about COVID-19 and we think about the disparities, so you have all of these traumas intersecting together so that people are not um, able to experience, after the end of the Civil War, smallpox was a thing, and they knew at that time that isolation and quarantine was a thing that would save lives. But these quarantines were not available to former enslaved people. And so even, so even back then you have the impact of the inability to quarantine. So you think about COVID-19 and you think about who are the people who are working on the front lines. These are people who have to work. They don't have the privilege and luxury of staying home. They don't, they're delivering Amazon. They're working in the grocery stores. And then you look at cities and, a place like Los Angeles where people who are on the bottom of the economic scale, they're living very, very closely together. So you have all of these intersecting traumas to give us our current medical situation. I know for me personally, having traveled in many countries around the world and having to have had to access healthcare in France, the healthcare, it was national healthcare for everyone, Medicare for all in essence, and I received excellent healthcare, and I was not even a French citizen. So when people say that Medicare for all is not available, they're actually lying, and they're putting profits over human beings. So these are conversations we have to have in order to start healing ourselves and taking care of ourselves and loving ourselves.